In the winter of 1867, families across northern Finland were grinding tree bark into flour and baking it into bread. Not because they'd run out of ideas, because they'd run out of everything else. And this wasn't rare. For most of human history, famine wasn't a distant tragedy. It was a recurring event, striking roughly once every few generations in agricultural societies around the world. And the methods people use to survive it get stranger the deeper you look. Start with that bark bread. Across Scandinavia and parts of Russia, when grain supplies failed, people stripped the inner layer of pine bark, dried it, and ground it into a coarse flour called petu in Finnish. It's mostly indigestible fiber with almost no real nutrition, but mixed with whatever grain remained, it stretched a starving family's food supply just far enough to survive another few weeks. The process itself took days, stripping, drying, and pounding the bark by hand long before it was even edible enough to bake. Timing mattered too. Bark had to be harvested in early summer when the sap was flowing, or the whole batch turned too bitter to choke down. Some rural communities kept using bark bread recipes well into the 20th century, not as a historical curiosity, but because the habit of stretching food never fully disappeared. Leather was another option, and not a metaphorical one. During prolonged sieges and Arctic expeditions, when every scrap of actual food ran out, people boiled leather, belts, boot soles, even old book bindings, for hours, sometimes days, softening it into something chewable. It offered almost nothing in the way of nutrition, but it filled the stomach, and in true starvation, that alone can buy someone another day. Members of failed polar expeditions, including parts of Franklin's doomed Arctic voyage, resorted to boiling and eating leather goods when supplies ran out entirely. Diaries from some of these expeditions describe rationing the boiled leather by the mouthful, tracking each piece as carefully as any other remaining food source. Some crews even melted down candle wax for the same reason. Anything with calories, however unappetizing, got a second look once true hunger set in. Then there's rock tripe, a tough, leathery lichen that grows directly on bare stone in cold climates. It looks completely inedible, and frankly, it mostly is. It's bitter, hard to digest, and can cause stomach problems if eaten raw. But boiled for long enough, it becomes a thick, gelatinous paste that multiple stranded explorers, including members of failed 19th century Arctic expeditions, relied on to survive weeks with almost no other food source. It's one of the few things on this list that people actively went looking for, scraping it directly off rock faces with knives, sometimes traveling considerable distances just to find a patch dense enough to be worth the effort. Some expedition journals describe rationing it by the handful, aware that even this strange, scraped off paste wouldn't last indefinitely. Straw and hay entered the human diet too, mixed sparingly into whatever grain flour remained, to make a loaf go further even though it added almost nothing but bulk. During the Russian famines of the early 20th century, bread made partly from ground straw, acorns, or even sawdust became common enough to have its own grim nickname among people living through it. Some accounts describe entire regions where this kind of bread became the norm rather than the exception, eaten daily for months at a time. It wasn't a delicacy, it was math, stretching 1 week of food into two, even if it meant stomach pain in exchange for survival. Perhaps the cruelest decision of all was what to do with seed grain, the portion set aside specifically to plant next year's crop. Eating it meant surviving today. Not eating it meant possibly starving before the next harvest even had a chance to grow. Historical records from multiple famines describe entire communities forced into this exact impossible choice, and the ones who ate their seed grain to survive the winter sometimes guaranteed an even worse famine the following year because there was nothing left to plant. Some village councils reportedly posted guards over seed grain stores specifically to stop desperate families from eating their way into next year's disaster, a decision that often turned neighbor against neighbor in communities that had otherwise survived together for generations. Livestock went next, and not just the animals raised for meat. Draft horses, oxen, even beloved working dogs were slaughtered and eaten once a household had exhausted every other option because a starving family couldn't afford the moral weight of watching children go hungry, while an animal that could no longer pull a plow anyway stayed alive. Losing a draft animal often meant losing the ability to farm effectively the following season too, compounding one disaster into the next. It was rarely a first resort. It was almost always a last one. Bones themselves became a food source. Old bones, sometimes ones that had already been boiled once for broth, were crushed, ground, and boiled again and again, extracting every last trace of fat and marrow the household could manage. Some accounts describe communities boiling the same bones repeatedly across multiple days, adding them back into weak soups just to add the faintest suggestion of nutrition to otherwise empty broth. In some regions, ground bone meal was even mixed directly into bread dough, adding calcium and a trace of protein to loaves that otherwise had almost nothing to offer. Nothing edible, and often plenty that wasn't, got wasted once a community understood exactly how close to the edge it was living. And in the absolute worst famines in recorded history, the ones so severe that virtually every other option had already been exhausted, historical records document instances of extreme measures, including cannibalism, a grim reality confirmed in documented cases from sieges, Arctic disasters, and famine conditions across multiple centuries and continents. It's the darkest possible endpoint of the same underlying math running through every method on this list. When a body is starving badly enough, the definition of food collapses down to almost nothing at all. What ties every one of these together isn't desperation alone, it's resourcefulness under conditions that should have made resourcefulness impossible. Nobody chooses bark bread or boiled leather because it sounds appealing. They choose it because the alternative is worse, and because somewhere in the human brain, even under extreme starvation, there's still a drive to find the next edible thing, however unlikely it looks. That same drive shows up again and again across completely unconnected cultures and centuries, as if scarcity itself teaches the same lessons no matter where or when it happens. Different continents, different diets, arriving independently at nearly identical, desperate solutions. Famine reshaped diets, farming practices, and even religious traditions in the societies that lived through it repeatedly. Some of these emergency foods, oddly enough, outlived the famines that created them, turning from desperate substitutes into regional traditions still eaten generations later, long after anyone eating them remembered why they existed in the first place. If this kind of history fascinates you, let me know what era or disaster you want covered next. And if this surprised you, hit like and subscribe, because next time we're covering survival methods almost nobody expects. See you in the next one.